Good afternoon. I'd like to thank Dr. McCall for introducing me and for having me. I'm coming a long way, as you know. When Dr. McCall contacted me, yes, actually, he got that recommendation from Father Couture on the basis of a lecture that I gave in Manila almost exactly 10 years ago on the invitation of Father Couture. So I travel a lot, as you can see. I also travel a lot to Japan because my wife is from Tokyo. So I'm a kind of globetrotter. But you know, Catholic means universal. Okay. Okay. I hope my English will be universal enough. I'm sorry if it's a bit patchy, but I'll do my best. Okay. So the making of the liturgical new books under Pope Paul VI. That's actually a massive topic. So I'll have to limit myself to some aspects of it. But the liturgical aggiornamento, as it was called by Pope John, the aggiornamento was not affected directly by the Second Vatican Council, but after the Council by a number of post-conciliar bodies. For example, the reform or the aggiornamento of the Code of Canon Law, for example. It was not published until 1983, because that was a massive work. So what Vatican II did, in fact, was give a blueprint, a number of general guidelines on a number of topics, including the liturgy, and then a number of post-conciliar bodies were set up to implement those broad guidelines. And in the case of the liturgy, that post-conciliar body was, as mentioned by a number of other speakers before me, it was the so-called Concilium. So let me explain first what the Concilium was, and then how it, its internal structure, how it worked internally. It was broken down into a number of sub-commissions. And then I'll take, as an example for the reform of the new Mass, I'll take the lectionary, the Sunday lectionary of the Missal. I'll tell you what the options for reforming the Sunday lectionary were, how they were decided, what role was played by the Concilium Fathers, by the experts, by the observers too, how they interacted, and then we'll come to a conclusion that is the end product, as it were. Okay. So first and foremost, let's see what the Concilium was not. It should not be confused with Vatican II. Vatican II is the Concilium. Okay. Okay, I'm displaying a slide. Vatican II is in Latin concilium, a council, whereas the post-conciliar liturgical commission was concilium, which means it's a Latin word that basically means a board, a commission. But because of the phonetic proximity between the two terms, the two are often confused. Actually, even some observers, I researched the private papers of a number of Protestant observers delegated to Concilium. Even some of them wrote Concilium for the Concilium. So they didn't even know the proper name of the body that they were invited to. So the Concilium was not a subcommittee or a subcommission of the Second Vatican Council. Here is how it came into existence. Well, the liturgical matters handled by Vatican II were first prepared by the Preparatory Commission for the Liturgy, just like all matters handled by Vatican II. You had a Preparatory Commission broken down into several smaller subcommissions So the preparatory commission for Canon O, for the liturgy, for ecumenical relations, whatever. But that was not the Concilium. What Vatican II did was promulgate a conciliar constitution for the liturgy called Sacrosanctum Concilium. Okay, let me show it. Sacrosanctum Concilium, that was the conciliar constitution for the liturgy that was adopted and promulgated on December the 4th, 1963. And then there was a need for a post-conciliar commission that would carry out, that would implement the blueprint of Sacrosanctum Concilium. And that commission was the Concilium. Yes, in addition, I have to say that the vast majority of the amount of research into the aggiornamento, at least into the liturgical aggiornamento, is usually invested into the Council itself, into Vatican II, while the work of the Concilium remains largely unresearched. Yes, actually there is, I noted that there is hardly any interest for studying the Concilium, even when a suggestion is made. And let me share you an anecdote in this respect. I happen to be personally acquainted with the vice chairman of the Italian state agency in charge of promoting academic research, the so-called Consiglio Nazionale delle Ricerche, so literally National Council for Research. So that is a state body in Italy that's in charge of coordinating academic research between all of the Italian universities. So being the vice chairman of that is really an important job. So I happen to know that guy personally. And I asked him if he was ready to help me find an Italian researcher for a PhD on the Concilium's work. I even added that he might himself be interested, because that gentleman does quite a lot of research into the aggiornamento, not the Concilium, but other aspects of the aggiornamento. And although I repeated my offer twice, he didn't even bother to reply. And by the way, this gentleman is pretty well known in traditionalist circles. His name is Professor Roberto De Mattei. So this is really puzzling, you see. I don't see how someone, I'm not pinpointing Professor Roberto De Mattei in particular, but I mean, in general terms, how can someone, or I mean anyone, criticize or even critique the liturgical aggiornamento if you don't study its genesis? So in most cases, it is the end product, that is the new liturgical books that were analyzed and criticized. But the process itself, the making of the liturgical books, is largely a terra incognita. And that is why I'm devoting my PhD to the actual making of the liturgical books. I mean, as part of the internal modus operandi of the Concilium, that is how the different actors within the Concilium interacted. So back to the Concilium now. Its full name, it's called Concilium for short, but its full name, as you can see, is Concilium ad exequendam constitutionem de sacra liturgia. That's pretty long. It means Concilium in charge of implementing the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. And the Concilium was officially created by the Motu Proprio Sacram Liturgiam, that was released on January the 5th, 1964. Sacram Liturgiam was the first document of implementation of Sacrosanctum Concilium, of the Conciliar Constitution. But it was, Sacram Liturgiam had a very limited scope. It basically singled out a limited number of concrete measures. And the most important aspect of Sacram Liturgiam was precisely that it created a specific body, the Concilium, that was tasked with translating, as it were, translating the very broad and unspecific provisions of Sacrosanctum Concilium into concrete measures. what the Concilium was supposed to do was to translate or interpret, the very broad provisions of Sacrosanctum Concilium, and to eventually put forward new liturgical books and sacramental books. Let me give you an example. Article 35 of Sacrosanctum Concilium calls for a broader access to the riches of Holy Scripture, and not only in the Mass, actually. So that's an extremely generic provision of Sacrosanctum Concilium. So the Concilium's task on this was to put forward an enlarged lectionary not only for the Missal, but also for the Divine Office and for the sacraments. For example, in the Eastern Rites, you have in the Coptic or Armenian, Ethiopian and Byzantine churches, you usually have several biblical readings before a sacrament. So biblical readings related, of course, to the sacrament that is being administered. One of the tasks of the Concilium was to select a number of biblical readings to enrich the rituals, so the Book of Sacraments, for example. Yes, actually, to give you an idea of how broad the task of the Concilium was, it was supposed to revise all of the liturgical and sacramental books, that is, the Missal for Mass, but please remember that the Missal is not just the ordinary of the Mass, it's much more, of course. You have all the propers of the Mass. It was supposed to revise the Divine Office, so the breviary, and then the ritual for sacraments, plus the pontifical, the rites of the papal chapel, the martyrology, etc., etc. So it was really a huge task, and there was obviously a need for breaking down that work into smaller, more specialized units. So the Concilium was broken down into some 30 to 40 subcommittees. Actually, their number varied a bit because it was impossible to really plan ahead, several years ahead, the number of subcommittees that would be needed. So as they went along, they sometimes split or merged a number of working groups of subcommittees, but their number was always comprised between 30 and 40. Let me give you an example of how specialized it was. For example, for the Divine Office, you had 9 working groups. Those working groups were called cetus a studiis, that is, study groups, literally, or working groups. They were usually called cetus. So 9 of them just for the Divine Office, including one that was in charge of coordinating all the 8 cetus actually working on the Divine Office, plus 1 9th in charge of coordinating it. They had 6 of them for the Missal, for example, including also 1 just for the coordination of everything. They had 3 cetus, 3 working groups for the Pontifical, for example, 3 for the ritual. So it was pretty detailed. As my subject is the making of the new Mass, let's not forget, when it comes to the Mass, that is much more than the ordinary of the Mass. For example, I'm very interested. I don't know if you're aware of a book by Dr. Lauren Pristas about the collects of the Roman Missals. That's a part of the Missal that's often neglected, but she wrote 3 important articles plus a major book on the subject. Her book is called Collects of the Roman Missals so both Roman missals, the Old and the New, a comparative study of the Sundays in proper seasons before and after the Second Vatican Council. And actually, it would seem that Laurent Pristas, I've not gotten in touch with her so far, but it would seem that she is one of the very few who actually investigated the Concilium's work, because I see in the presentation of her book, she says, pertinent discussions and decisions of the Concilium study groups responsible for the post-Vatican II revisions of the liturgical calendar and of mass collects are also presented and considered. So she also considered and analyzed the discussions and Concilium and decisions, of the study groups of the Concilium. Now, if you want to have an exhaustive synopsis of all the work that was effected by the Concilium, it was published in Notitiae, which was the official publication of the Concilium. Actually, in a 1982 issue, Archbishop Piero Marini published all of the so-called schemata of the Concilium. The schemata, just as in the case of Vatican II, what is called a schema, is a technical term. It's a project, a draft. You would call it a bill, as it were, legislative terms. And there were hundreds of them, because each of the Cetus published several schemata when they had to be revamped, revised, reviewed, etc. And you have, the August-September 1982 issue of Notitiae contains an exhaustive list of all the, I don't remember, 600 or something schemata published, elaborated by the Concilium. And as I said, that was published by Archbishop Piero Marini. You may know him. He's the Master of Ceremonies standing next to Pope Benedict. He was actually a protege of Archbishop Bugnini. And under John Paul II, he became Master of Ceremonies of the Papal Chapel. But in methodological terms, I have to say that his list of these exhaustive list of the schemata of the Concilium is an excellent instrumentum laboris. Mm-hmm. In terms of the Cetuses of the Concilium, the Cetus number 1 was the one tasked with the revision of the calendar, because, as Archbishop Bugnini said, that Cetus was the most important one in a certain sense, the most crucial one, because so many other elements of the liturgical and sacramental books depend on the calendar, so on the reform of the calendar in that case. So it was the first Cetus that began working, and it received a kind of architectonic role in the Concilium. But for my part, I cannot possibly survey the whole scope of the Aggiornamento. I shall focus, as I told you, on the lectionary of the Missal, and even more specifically on the Sunday lectionary of the Missal. First, let me tell you how the Concilium worked. I mean, its internal modus operandi. Actually, although the Concilium was not a conciliar commission, it was a post-conciliar commission with very wide-ranging executive bodies. It reported directly to the Pope. But although it was not a conciliar body, it worked pretty much along the same lines as a conciliar commission. So you basically had a chairman, who was first Archbishop Lercaro, Archbishop of Bologna, and then Abbot Gut, a Swiss Benedictine abbot, who later became cardinal. Then you had the secretary of the Concilium, executive secretary, of course, the infamous Monsignore and later Archbishop Bugnini. Then you had the patres, so the fathers, there were about 100 of them, all of them bishops, and they were those who actually made the formal decisions. They met in so-called plenarii, so plenary sessions, and the work was prepared by the individual cetuses, so the 30 to 40 cetuses, working groups. And this is how it worked. Actually, the cetuses had technical meetings in between the plenary sessions. There were a couple of plenarii a year, 2 or 3. And in between, the individual cetuses would meet. Actually, a cetus was a fairly small body with 5 to 10 experts. So it was fairly flexible. And they met in between the plenary sessions, and once the work was advanced enough, they would put forward their drafts to a plenary session, to the patres, to the fathers, to the bishops. On top of that, you had the observers. They did not arrive at the Concilium until October 1966. That's important because the Concilium was created, as I showed you, it was created in early 1964. And it started working almost immediately, but there were no observers on the Concilium until the plenary session of October 1966. And so there were originally 5 observers from different Anglican and Protestant denominations, and then in 1968 a further 6 was added, an American Lutheran, by the way. And right before each plenaria, there would be a so-called cetus relatorum, that is a meeting of the heads, of the chairman of the individual cetuses. They would have an informal meeting just a few days before the start of each plenary session, just to coordinate and to fine-tune their drafts to be put forward to the plenaria. Yes, actually, I forgot to mention that in each cetus you had, each cetus was headed by a so-called relator, so a kind of chairman, as it were, assisted by a secretary, and then you had the 5 to 10 members of each cetus. This is important to understand because this is where the observers will come into play, and you will see how they fit in that picture. So how did the observers work? Were they just observers or not, or did they have an active part? Well, you may remember that Michael Davis mentioned a number of things about that in his in one of his 3 books that make up his trilogy. Was it Paul's New Mass, I believe? But Archbishop Bugnini actually published it. Yes, Archbishop Bugnini himself explained in Notitiae, so the official publication of the Concilium, in 1966, as early as 1966, so right after the presence, after the observers came to the Concilium for the first time, he explained how it worked. He wrote, well, let me quote in Latin and then I'll translate. Novum in hac sessione et quidem magni momenti fuit presentia quinque observatorum aberum communitatibus ecclesialibus, designatorum, qui labores concilii cum gaudio diligentia et fraterna cooperatione in colloquiis cum relatoribus sunt secuti. So he said, a new element in this session, and a very important one, a major one, was the presence of 5 observers delegated by their respective church communities. They followed the work of the Concilium with, well, how would you say, gaudio et diligentia, so with joy. And et fraterna cooperatione, so with fraternal cooperation in colloquies, in their conversations with the relatoribus, so with the chairman of the individual cetus. That was published in Notitia number 23, November 1966. I know that at Econ Seminary in Switzerland, they have the whole collection of Notitiae, but they have never pointed this out. I don't know why. So Bonini explains that the cooperation with the observers was happening in informal conversations between the observers and the chairman of the individual cetuses. And Canon Jasper, so one of the 2 Anglican observers who wrote to Michael Davis about the way he participated, wrote this, because actually I noted that in Michael Davis's book, you don't find the actual letter of Canon Jasper, the Anglican observer. So I asked Michael Davis, before he died, I asked him, and I received an actual copy, a photocopy, a Xerox of the letter of Canon Jasper. Here's what Canon Jasper says. Dear Mr. Davies, your letter eventually reached me, etc. The observers received all the documents from the drafters of the new services in the same way as did all the other members of the Concilium. He says Concilium. Well, we were then present at the debates when they were presented by the experts and debated by the Concilium, but the observers were not allowed to join in the debate. So that was the plenary meetings, of course, because even the experts were not supposed to interrupt the discussions between the bishops. I'll show you a picture of the actual room where they met. Here it is. You see, this is a plenaria, a plenary session. You have the bishop sitting at the table in the center, and you have the periti, at least a part of the periti of the experts, sitting behind, along the wall, and all the way down the room, you have a small table there, and you have the observers sitting there. So you can actually visualize how they were physically integrated into the debates. So these were the plenary meetings where nobody was supposed to intervene, to interrupt the debates between the bishops. They, of course, had a number of breaks and coffee breaks and whatever, but during the general debates, only the bishops were allowed to speak. So neither the Catholic experts nor the observers. So that is why Canon Jasper, the Anglican Canon Jasper, is explaining. But he adds, in the afternoon, however, we always had an informal meeting between the periti, so the experts, the members of the cetuses, between the periti who had prepared the draft services, and those meetings were certainly, we were certainly allowed to comment and criticize and make suggestions. It was then for the periti, for the experts of the cetuses, to decide whether any of our points were worth taking up when the general debates resumed in the Concilium. So when the the plenary session resumed. But those informal discussions with the periti were completely free-for-all, and there was a very frank exchange of views. So you can see where the observers fit in. They intervened during the cetus relatorum, so the informal meeting of the chairman of the individual cetuses right before the plenary sessions, and they intervened also. They also had informal talks with the chairman of the working groups each afternoon, because actually the plenary sessions were usually taking place only in the morning. Yes, actually, I researched the archives of the World Lutheran Federation in Geneva, and I found a number of letters. I found evidence that the observers came to Rome a few days before the plenary sessions started. So it probably means that they came to Rome during the cetus relatorum, so during the informal meeting of the chairman of the working groups, so as to have an exchange of views with them right before the plenary started. That's interesting, you know. Sometimes in archives you can find lots of documents that would seem unimportant, and you have hotel bookings and that kind of things, but then when you check the dates, you say, why did they arrive in Rome 3 days before the plenary session started? And then you check that against the dates of the cetus relatorum, and it matches. So thanks to the Lutheran World Federation, I know a bit more about that, you know. The Lutherans can be very friendly guys, you know, sometimes. So let's now focus on the lectionary of Sunday Masses, and you'll see what role was played by the observers in that in the revision of the Sunday lectionary. As I mentioned earlier, the lectionary of the Missal was to be revised and expanded since the conciliar constitution, Sacrosanctum Concilium, called for a wider use of Holy Scripture. Now, there were, of course, multiple possible options for such an expansion, for such an enlargement of the lectionary. And most importantly, one of the key questions was, should the Concilium work out a completely new lectionary or expand the existing one, work on the basis of the existing one? It goes without saying that the principle of organic development called for an expansion of the existing lectionary. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of organic development. It was what's his name? Alcuin Reid published a book called The Organic Development of the Liturgy, which is actually a part of his PhD dissertation. And he explains that the so-called organic development of the liturgy is a principle according to which the liturgy is like a living being, a plant, a flower, as it were. So the flowers that you have today are not, in a way, they're not the same as the flowers you had yesterday or you had in winter. They're not going to be the same tomorrow, next week, and next month, but it's still the same plant and the same flower, see? So it's both different and the same, because that's the principle of every living being. You are not the same person as the young boy or the young girl you were when you were 10, and you will not be the same person in 2 years' time, in 10 years' time, but in another way you're still the same person. And that's how the liturgy should be should be revised, should be reformed. That's how it should grow. So according to that principle of so-called organic development. So that revision of the lectionary of the Mass was assigned to Cetus number 11, which was Cetus de lectionibus biblicis in missa, so biblical readings, biblical lessons in the Mass. The secretary of Cetus number 11 was Father Gaston Fontaine of Canada. He drew up an exhaustive review of all the lectionaries of Holy Mass used in all the Western and Eastern rites. So in the Western rites, you have not only the Roman rites, but you have the rites of Braga in Portugal, for example. You have the Ambrosian rite in Milan, well, I don't remember, but whatever. And in the Eastern rites, you have not only the Byzantine rite, but you have also the Armenian rite, the Syrian rite, the Coptic rite, the Ethiopian rite, and the Chaldean rite. So Father Fontaine studied all of that, the lectionaries of all those churches, both presently and diachronically, that is, through the centuries. So it was a huge task, and I had a chance to see his work. That's a very good work. So you would imagine that on the basis of such an exhaustive study, the Concilium would have taken it as a basis on which to build, to grow an organically grown, an organic product, as it were. Yes, actually retaining the traditional lectionary was one of the options, and it was supported by the ecumenical argument. That might sound surprising, but actually the ecumenical criterion didn't always play into the hands of the liberals. Sometimes it played into the hands of the conservatives. And in the case of the lectionary of the Missal, you have to know that, the lectionary of the Mass that you have in your 1962 Missals, it was shared until Vatican II by most, at least a large number of Protestant and Anglican denominations, sometimes with a few variations, but it was largely shared. So that ecumenical argument played into the hands of the conservatives in that case. So the chances were that the existing lectionary was going to be retained and that it would be just expanded. So that was the expectation. But then Father Vagaggini came into play, the terrible, infamous Father Vagaggini, an Italian Benedictine. Father Vagaggini was the relator, so the chairman of that Cetus in charge of revising the lectionary of the Missal. And he sounded a very different note. He said that although the ecumenical argument seemed to be in favor of retaining the traditional lectionary and in favor of taking it as a basis for an enlarged lectionary, he said, well, in fact, the actual situation is a bit different from what many experts and fathers of the Concilium believe. And he took 8 examples. First, the Anglican churches of the so-called London group have abandoned the traditional lectionary they had abandoned it as early as 1965, and they had adopted a 2-year cycle for the lectionary. then the Anglicans of India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka had elaborated a new cycle of lessons, of readings, for at least for the Sunday propers, but in addition to the lectionary of the prayer book. And the lectionary of the prayer book was largely similar, was almost identical to the 1962 one. So, in Germany, the Lutheran Evangelische Michaelsbruderschaft had added a group of 28 pericopes to the traditional lectionary. Actually, what is called a pericope is a technical word to refer to a passage of Holy Scripture. In your hand missal, you have, for every day, you have a pericope. You don't know it's called a pericope, but that's it. It's a technical term, simply. So they had, the Evangelische Michaelsbruderschaft had added a selection of 28 pericopes as an addition to the traditional lectionary. Then the German Lutheran Church, had conserved the traditional lectionary, but for predication they used, so yes, they preached on the basis of another lectionary than the lectionary that was actually used in the services. It's a bit original, but that's how it was. Then the Lutherans of Switzerland and Denmark have an additional lectionary ad libitum in addition to the traditional lectionary. The Reformed Church in France had adopted a wholly new lectionary with a 3-year cycle as early as 1953, and then the so-called Old Catholics follow the traditional lectionary, but they have also adopted ad libitum, so optionally a cycle of three lessons, 3 readings. So Father Vagaggini, what he said basically was the ecumenical argument in favor of retaining the traditional lectionary is not as solid as you might believe. So we shouldn't feel compelled to retain the traditional lectionary. If we want to have to ecumenically share the word of God, he said, we could create a new lectionary on the basis of the new systems that have been introduced recently in those different Protestant denominations. That's basically what he said. Yes. So when Father Vagaggini said that, it was in October 1966. So the very first session, as you remember, the very first session where the Protestant observers were invited. So they were immediately consulted on that matter. And on the 8th of October, that is their 3rd day at the Concilium, they were consulted on the projects for the new lectionary. And, they were of the opinion, the observers were of the opinion that it was quite possible to elaborate a new lectionary on an ecumenical basis, as there was a drive towards creating new lectionaries in both Protestant denominations and also in the Catholic Concilium. So that was on October the 8th. And then on October the 10th, Canon Jasper, So the observer from the Church of England read a declaration on behalf of all the five observers. Sorry, a declaration in which he said that the best option would be to work together between their Protestant denominations and the Concilium, so as to produce a new ecumenical lectionary that would be introduced ad experimentum. Actually, he wanted to have it ad experimentum because a lectionary of a missal is a very complex thing, and those Protestant denominations were also undergoing. They were also going through a process of liturgical reforms. They were confronted typically with the same problems as the Catholic Church, growing secularism, disaffection for church going, etc. So they saw this as an opportunity to pray on the same basis with the same book, at least the Sunday lectionary, and to share the Word of God, as it were. So that's Canon Jasper, as I said, delegated by the Church of England, read out a declaration in plenary session on October the 10th. That was the only occasion, as far as I know, the only occasion at which an observer actually intervened in a plenary session. And I checked that in the memoirs of Monsignor Bonini, called in English, I believe, The Reform of the Liturgy. Okay. I checked it, and Monsignor Bonini says that that was the only intervention of the observers in a plenary session. Okay. Now, in a plenary session, but as you saw earlier, on the basis of the testimony of Canon Jasper, in that letter to Michael Davis, and also on the basis of the article written by Bonini himself in Notitiae, the official publication of the Concilium, they had informal talks on a regular basis with the chairman of the working groups. And what I also found out in the archives of the Lutheran World Federation is that the observers were invited to join in the coffee breaks during the breaks during the plenary sessions. And as you know, that's typically when corridor diplomacy, lobby diplomacy takes place, of course. Yes, as I mentioned, almost all the Protestant and Anglican denominations were also undergoing a process of reform and largely of aggiornamento, of modernizing, at the same time as the Roman Catholic Church. That's also why they sent observers to Vatican II, by the way, because they were confronted with the modern world, with the spirit of the modern world. And so there were confrontations between what you could call liberals and conservatives within those different Protestant and Anglican denominations. And in most cases, just as in the Roman Catholic Church, the liberals were having the upper hand. But it's interesting to note that actually Abbot Christhard Marenholtz, Lutheran abbot from Germany, was the chairman of the liturgical commission of the German Lutheran Church, and he was consulted on the draft of the new lectionary, because actually the job, the task of the observers was not only to interact with the perity, with the experts, but it was also to be go-betweens, to act as go-betweens between the Concilium and their own denominations. So they reported back to their denominations who were interested in coordinating or confronting their viewpoints with the Catholics, so as to sort of find inspiration or coordinate or whatever, but at least so as to be in contact and to make contact with the Catholics, because that was viewed as important for the liturgical aggiornamento of the Protestant and Anglican denominations. And so Abbot Christard Marenholtz was actually, he was a conservative Lutheran. You might even say a traditionalist Lutheran, perhaps. And when he got the first draft of the projected lectionary for Sunday Mass, he called it Rationalismus und Konstruktivismus, so rationalism and constructivism. And when I saw that word, Konstruktivismus, it reminded me of a famous word by another famous German, Cardinal Ratzinger. Cardinal Ratzinger, who spoke of committee manufactured liturgy. Manufactured liturgy, that's a word that was often used by Cardinal Ratzinger and by the liturgists that share his views. So, as you see, there was some resistance. There was some resistance within some Protestant communities because they had their Ratzingerians or their conservatives or their traditionalists or whatever. And as a matter of fact, Abbot Marenholtz was not consulted anymore by the Concilium. They were not interested because they felt resistance from his side. But what I found in the archives of the World Lutheran Federation is that he had been invited on an informal basis to a meeting of Cetus 11, so the Cetus on the lectionary of the Missal. He had been invited on a private and informal basis to one of their technical meetings of that Cetus in close to Neuburg in Austria. That's Benedictine Abbey just outside Vienna in Austria. And that was in June 1966. Now, you remember that the Protestants were not officially invited to Rome, to the Concilium, until October 1966. So this is interesting, as part of the Bugnini system. In Archbishop Bugnini's view of the world, his will was supreme, so there were no rules except his own will. And as actually, he started the process of trying to invite a number of non-Catholic observers in 1964. But as it was, with the bureaucratic nature of the Roman Curia, he didn't get the observers until October 1966. And as the process was too slow for him, he decided to invite, on a private and informal basis, Abbot Marenholtz to technical meeting of Cetus number 11 in June 1966. Yes, I have what we call in Latin confidentem reum, because I found this actually in a letter dated May the 30th, 1966, a letter from Archbishop Bugnini to André Appel, a French Lutheran. I found it in the archives of the World Lutheran Federation in Geneva, if you want the references, WO 7.3 Geneva. Okay, so that's it. I mean, it's documented. So as I said, Abbot Marenholtz was no more consulted after he gave a negative opinion on the draft. And so the reform of the lectionary, and not only of the lectionary, of the Mass too, and of the sacraments, of all the liturgical and sacramental books, was kind of negotiated by the liberals, by all the liberal wings, both in the with the Catholics and the Protestant and Anglicans. Let me tell you an anecdote. A few years ago, I was in Dresden, in Germany, and I was invited to the Lutheran Vespers by a group of highly conservative traditionalist Lutherans, as it were. And it was exactly Sunday Vespers as we know them. It was just in German translation, but in what you call Hochdeutsch, so in a very it's not everyday German, if you like. It's literary German. It's very fine literary German, but otherwise the tunes, the melodies, everything, the hymns, everything was just the traditional Vespers as we know them. If the traditional wings, both in the Roman Catholic Church and in the Protestant and Anglican denominations, had the upper hand, we would probably have had a liturgical reform that would have been, negotiated by, well, not negotiated, but it would have been enacted by conservatives, and we would not have the kind of liberal services that we have now. And yes, actually the same goes for some Anglicans, the so-called Anglo-Catholics, until Vatican II, possibly even now, I don't know, but some so-called Anglo-Catholics use the Tridentine Mass almost without any variation. But as I said, it was not that wing that had the upper hand. So that's why we now have liberal services and a liberal lectionary, etc. So as Canon Jasper read out that declaration on behalf, not only on behalf of himself, but also on behalf of all the 5 observers on October the 10th, 1966, they decided, both the Catholics and the Protestants and Anglicans, they decided to start from scratch a new lectionary. The consensus, there was an ecumenical consensus for a brand new lectionary. They started from zero. Actually, what you have to know is that the ecumenical criterion was always a major criterion in reforming the lectionary. It was always about having an ecumenical consensus. I found, I have lots of technical documents from the technical meetings and from the plenaries of the Concilium, and they're always concerned about maintaining unity between the Catholic experts and the Protestant observers. So a major criterion in the reform of the lectionary was ecumenical consensus. And in that respect, let me show you, okay, this, actually Dr. McCall quoted exactly the same sentence earlier today, this morning. Okay, you have it in the original Latin, then in English translation. I'm sorry, but the hyperlink doesn't seem to work. I took it from the Vatican website, of course. So this Sacred Council has several aims in view, and what I'm interested in is, of course, to foster whatever can promote union among all who believe in Christ. So, quid ad unionem omnium in Christum credentium conferre potest favere. So, as Dr. McCall mentioned this morning, one of the aims of Sacrosanctum Concilium, of the Conciliar Constitution on the liturgy, is ecumenism, promoting ecumenism, or more precisely, promoting Christian unity through the liturgy, through having a common or a more common liturgy between our different Christian churches. So, actually, what Sacrosanctum Concilium is saying here is that the liturgy should be used as an instrument to promote Christian unity. So let's reform the liturgy so as to use it as a tool to promote Christian unity. And what I have to underscore is that this is the very first sentence of Sacrosanctum Concilium. Well, actually, it's the first 2 words, the so-called incipit So that's where the Constitution takes its name from, Sacrosanctum Concilium, because the first sentence starts with Sacrosanctum Concilium. This is not even the first article of Sacrosanctum Concilium. It is so-called Prefatio, so the preamble. So in the very first sentence of the Conciliar Constitution on the Liturgy, Vatican II says, one of our aims is to use the liturgy as a tool to attain Christian unity. And that's what they did in the case of the Lectionary of the Missal, obviously. What I also thank Dr. McCall for stealing my idea, and when it comes to the final cause, to the concept of end, of final cause. The final cause is always first as an intention and always last in the order of execution. So if you want to travel to my country, Belgium, that would be an excellent decision, for example. Okay, you want to visit Belgium, you're right, it's a beautiful country, okay, you're welcome. Okay, so that's your aim, okay? We're beings of purpose. So in the order of intention, it's the first thing. But it will be the last one in the order of execution, because you will have to budget your trip, you will have to possibly consult a travel agent, you will visit websites and blogs, you will take information about Belgium, you will check what the the best options are for flying to Belgium, etc., etc. Okay, you will check if you need a visa. Well, you don't. So that is exactly what happened in the case of the ecumenical aim of Sacrosanctum Concilium. It was first, in the very first sentence, in the order of intention, and it came last, I mean, as the end product in the order of execution. And in fact, what I noted was while the Protestant observers were invited as a separate group on the margin of the Concilium, as it were, as observers, the first intention, the first suggestion in 1964 was to invite non-Catholic ministers not as observers, but as members of a cetus mixtus, a joint working group. That's highly interesting, isn't it? I have a letter, an exchange of letters between Monsignor Bugnini and Monsignor Wagner, who was the chairman and founder of the Deutsches Liturgisches Institut, the German Liturgical Institute, which was one of the major promoters of the liturgical reform. It's still a very powerful body nowadays. Let me see if I have the... Yes, Monsignor Bugnini writes on November the 3rd, 1964, so the council was still going on. I mean, the Concilium was founded so in January 1964. Vatican II ended in December 1965. So technically speaking, the Concilium started working while Vatican II was still going on, but it was not a part of Vatican II. It was an executive commission with wide-ranging powers, wide-ranging autonomy. So Vatican II was still going on. It was not yet finished when Monsignor Bugnini wrote to Monsignor Wagner, Dr. Wagner of Germany. Well, he wrote in Latin, petitur a nobis ut constituamus cetum mixtum pro relationibus cum protestantibus. So, petitur a nobis, we're being asked, we're being requested. By whom? I don't know. Perhaps I'll find out someday in some archive, but so far I don't know. We're being asked to set up a cetus mixtus, so a joint working group for relations with the Protestants. And on November the 14th, he gets an answer from Dr. Wagner suggesting a number of names for that. And what I found especially striking was Father Gélineau, you know, a French Jesuit who was very familiar with the liturgy of Thésée And that is exactly what Monsignor Wagner says. Qui optime nocit liturgiam de These, who is very, very knowledgeable about the liturgy of These. So, as you see, in 1964, the idea, the intention was to have a joint working group with the Protestants within the Concilium. Actually, that attempt was rejected. I don't know by whom. So far, I don't know. Well, perhaps my research will allow me to find out. What I know is that actually the mandate and the mission of the observers to the Concilium was defined as part of a negotiation between the Concilium, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, that was still headed by Cardinal Ottaviani at the time, and the Pontifical, Pontifical Secretariat for Promoting Christian Unity. So it might be that the suggestion to have a joint working group to integrate the non-Catholic ministers in a joint working group, it might have been rejected by the Holy Office, by Cardinal Ottaviani, possibly. I'll find out, perhaps. But anyway, what you have to see is that such was the intention of Bugnini, of the Secretary of the Concilium. His intention was to have a joint working group. So you shouldn't be surprised if the Protestant observers further down the road were de facto integrated into the internal working of the Concilium. The intention was a spirit of cooperation with the Protestants. So now to the options used for the lectionary. They decided to have 3 readings on Sundays, to have a 3-year cycle. They decided to have almost the whole Bible, Old and New Testament, read on throughout this 3-year cycle, and actually, yes. What is interesting is that there were also cross-Protestant consultations. For example, Observer Künnert, who was one of the 2 Lutheran observers, organized meetings at Thésée on the subject, and the World Council of Churches also organized a meeting with no less than 7 representatives of the Concilium in late April 1969 in Geneva. That was also published in Notizie. What the World Council of Churches wanted to do was to have consultations with all the Protestant denominations, not just the 5 ones that had delegated observers to the Concilium, because the World Council of Churches is a kind of United Nations of Christianity, as it were. So they saw themselves as having that a driving role, in promoting Christian unity, and they resented seeing Rome being in charge of promoting Christian unity, because in their view, Rome was, I wouldn't say part of the problem, but Rome was one of the denominations involved. So, the Roman Catholic Church was not impartial, as viewed by the World Council of Churches. So they viewed themselves as a kind of impartial interdenominational body, as it were. And the report that was drafted after that meeting in Geneva stated that there is a need for joint efforts on both long-term issues and on issues of immediate concern, like the working out of models of ecumenical services and lectionaries. So that's pretty clear, I believe. Mm-hmm. And so in the event, they arrived at a common lectionary. Actually, if you Google common lectionary or revised common lectionary, because it was revised later on, you will see hundreds of thousands of occurrences, of results, because that lectionary was actually adopted by, I don't know how many, but probably tens of Protestant denominations. And actually there was at Temple University in Philadelphia, Dr. Regina Boisclair published a doctoral dissertation on that topic. Her dissertation is entitled Proclaiming Salvation, the Hermeneutics of Six Contemporary Christian Lectionaries, and she studied actually the process of cooperation between the different churches and denominations in working out that new lectionary. And she sets out the criteria that were used for selecting the new pericopes. Okay, so let me finish. So as you saw, the new lectionary was created ex nihilo, ex novo, actually, from scratch. There was a suggestion to actually use the existing lectionary as a basis, as one of the 3 ABC years, of the new lectionary. But Father Vagaggini, the chairman of Cetus number 11, said that that lectionary was deeply flawed, you see. Actually, it's a lectionary that goes back for the epistles, it goes back to St. Jerome. So St. Jerome was deeply flawed, and the Holy Ghost has probably been deeply flawed since St. Jerome, 15 centuries, yes. And as far as the Gospel pericopes are concerned, they go back to the 12th century at least. So you see. So they rejected as I mentioned at the beginning, the exhaustive review that had been conducted by Father Fontaine, so on the basis of the lectionaries of the Western and Eastern churches, both present and past. They didn't take any of that. They built from scratch. So what it meant was really rejecting any traditional basis, Western, Eastern, whatever. And just a final quote, the most interesting bit of it. When Pope Paul VI promulgated the new lectionary, in the letter that he wrote to Cardinal Gut, so Cardinal Gut was the chairman of the second chairman. He had succeeded Cardinal Lecaro, who was the first chairman. And in his letter of approbation, Pope Paul VI wrote, let me translate it, I have it in Italian, we cannot possibly, in the very short period of time that is being assigned to us, so you see the Concilium assigns a deadline to the Pope. Okay, Holy Father, we're in a hurry, we're on the rush, please promulgate it by next week or whatever, by next month, because we're in a hurry. So in this very brief period of time that was assigned to us, we cannot possibly have a full and in-depth vision of this new Ordo Lectionum, of this new order of lessons. But the Pope goes on saying, however, I trust the experts of the Concilium, so I promulgate it. So you see. So that was the Sunday lectionary of the Missal, as you see. You saw how it was, on what basis it was elaborated, how it was elaborated. And you see the result, and it was not even properly read by the Pope before being promulgated. Well, that's it.